switched it up a little bit on y'all today. I am the special. No, I'm excited. Patty was very intentional with her selection, and so with it being Communion Sunday, she wanted to have a special right before Communion, and I think that's beautiful, great idea. And so you get me a little bit earlier in the service. But we're going to be in Matthew 5, 31, and 32 today. Matthew 5, 31, and 32. And so when I was growing up, the Lord blessed me with 4 great friends. And I went through high school with them together. Most of us went to college together. We were in each other's weddings. We are in and celebrate our birthdays, kids' birthdays. But about a couple of years ago, when Victoria and I moved back to Danville, 2 of my friends came to me and let me know that they were going to be getting a divorce. And as I got to walk with them through some of what they went through, it was one of the most humbling experiences having to watch a close friend of mine go through the high hopes of being in their wedding and what they were hoping, and then the reality of the situation that they found themselves in. And they would be okay at best, and you got to see them wrestle through pain and suffering. And even at their best days, they are still, to this day, okay, even many years removed. They're still carrying those wounds with them. And as a youth pastor, I got to, I don't know if get to is the right word, but I walked with students as their parents got divorces. And so as we study what we're looking at today, it is not my first selection of passages that I wish I could teach from. But I also realize that what we're talking about can be pretty heavy. I would be willing to bet that most of us in the room, if not all of us, have gone through or experienced, impacted by a divorce. Whether that's family, friends, people within your community. And so I want you to know that I have no axe to grind here. There is nobody that I wrote this in mind for. When we select and say we're going to go through a chunk of scripture together, we're going through the Sermon on the Mount together, we're going through a book of the Bible together, I don't get to pick what we go through at that point. And so when a verse comes up, it's my responsibility to teach it. And so I just ask that you would lean forward a little bit. I'm going to present some things that maybe you haven't heard, and I hope that you have. But Jesus and what he's going to do in Matthew 5, and when we get to Matthew 19 later, he's going to be holding up 2 ideals. And it is up to us to wrestle with these 2 ideals. And so I hope that we lean in and we see what Jesus is trying to do. And so with that, let's go ahead and jump into Matthew 5, 31 to 32. It says, "It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Here's what I want you to see. Jesus, remember, as we're going through the Sermon on the Mount, he has been going through and he has been talking, whether what we just talked about, on how we are to treat the people around us as we look at them and be careful of lustfully looking at the people around us. As we went into last week and the weeks before, Jesus has focused in on time and time again about how we treat the people around us. He is concerned about us living a righteous life. Now, righteous life is going to flow into, I want you to see what we looked at last week with how we treat the people around us. I'm not murdering them, not harboring anger against them, and to what we just looked at this morning with scripture, or with lust. And now he's going to focus on divorce. So I want you to see that first, as we get into divorce, this is a part of a bigger conversation that's happening about us living righteously and treating the people around us with righteousness. Now, let me set the scene for you. I want you to imagine, if you can, that you are a woman living 2,000 years ago, around the time of Jesus. And as a woman, I need you to know that you would not have a lot of rights that you do today. During that time, a woman's responsibility, just the messenger here, this is how their culture was, is that you were to be more focused in on your home. And so you would make sure that everything within the home was tidy, was good, not just in cleaning, but you were responsible for going to get water that day because they didn't have running water. So you were making sure sure every aspect of the home was good. If you had children, then your responsibilities were to help raise the kids. And if you were really, really lucky and you had a great husband, then you would possibly get to be a part of the family business. But that's not always guaranteed. And so women were completely dependent on their husbands for their income. Women were completely dependent on husbands for their social status in the community, what the husband did and how much money he brought on to determine the status within the community. And they were completely dependent on their husbands for legal matters. So in the courts during that time, a woman could not just simply go in and do whatever she wants legally. She would have to rely on her husband. Now this is going to be very important as we get into the text that we're looking at today. And so if you were to imagine, again, you're a woman living 2,000 years ago. Let's say that you have a couple kids and your marriage is okay. You've had some ups and you've had some downs, but recently your husband's been a little distant, and let's say, for one reason or another, he's had an affair. As a woman, you're going to have probably 3 different choices, and I'm going to eliminate one of them just for us to be able to look at what we're talking about. One of your choices would be to try to work through that relationship. Just cut that out for you to understand what Jesus is getting at. The second one would be divorce, and the third one would just be leaving him. But as a woman, you really only have one choice. Your only choice would be to leave him. As a woman, you wouldn't be able to go and initiate a divorce. As they go in, and then archaeologists have looked and dug through all of this documents from that time, there has been no documented cases that they can find of a woman of middle class or lower class initiating a divorce. It is always the man that initiates the divorce. The only times that they have found that a woman has initiated a divorce, which is a handful of times, has been from a very rich, very powerful family that is able to kind of shoulder their weight a little bit to get what needs to happen. And even then, she has to have a man that comes through and helps her through that process. And so I want you to see that as Jesus is entering into this conversation, because now he's gone from murder, he's gone to lust, and now he's going into marriage. Again, his concern is how we treat the people around us. And so for the NIV translation, you'll see it says in verse 32, about halfway through, it makes her the victim of adultery, or your translation is probably going to say it will make her commit adultery. Now, if you're a woman and your husband's cheated on you and you cannot repair the relationship, and you're to leave him, legally you're still married to him. Which means you do not have a lot of options. And so I want you to see that as Jesus enters into Matthew 5 and he gives a very short teaching on divorce, the reality and the situation that he's talking into is very different than it is today. What Jesus is much more concerned about is the women that are becoming victims of divorce because their husbands can simply divorce them for whatever reason. And if you are a woman and your whole livelihood depends on the man in your life, then that's going to leave a lot of destruction and chaos in the way. So let's jump forward a little bit into Matthew 19. Because remember, Jesus in Matthew 5 doesn't really give you a lot to go on. Okay? He just says 2 verses. It's all we got. The only other time Jesus is going to talk about it is Matthew 19. And now when we get to Matthew 19, we'll be in verses 3 to 10. But let me kind of set the scene of what's happening for divorce in this situation. Now the Pharisees do not care for Jesus. They do not like Jesus. And so at Matthew 19, by the time we get here, they're trying to trip Jesus up. What they want to do is ask him a bunch of hard questions with the goal of trying to either have Jesus stick his foot in his mouth and then kind of catch him in an aha moment, or for Jesus to land on one side of a debate and to split his followers. And so they're much more concerned with asking Jesus a tricky and difficult question than really this topic of divorce itself. So they don't care about the women or the men that are involved in divorce. All they care about is how Jesus is going to answer this question. So that's what we're walking into. Let's go ahead and go in Matthew 19, 3 to 10. Some Pharisees came to him to test him. They asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Haven't you heard, he replied, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female? And he said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So, they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. The disciples said to him, if this is the situation between a husband and a wife, it is better not to marry. So here's what I want you to see is happening. They asked Jesus this kind of gotcha question. They're intentionally asking him a difficult question. They care nothing about really what he says or the meat of what he's going to say. They only want to try to catch him. The second thing that I want you to see is that this is all centering on the Old Testament interpretation. In the Old Testament, you're given 600 commandments that you would have to follow. Only 2 of them deal with divorce. And they're only going to deal with them in passing. This conversation is based on Deuteronomy 24, where it says if your wife has any indecency about her, you can get a divorce. Now, there's going to be 2 schools of thought that are going to kind of form from this and come from this. And this is the waters that Jesus is going into as he answers the question. You have the school Shammai. The school Shammai is going to say that you can only divorce your wife if she has committed adultery or she has cheated on you. The second school of thought is the school of Hamel. Now, the school of Hamel is going to say that you can divorce your wife for any and every reason. If she is a bad cook, there's an indecency about her, and you can divorce her. If you find a prettier woman or a woman that offers more value to you, then you can divorce her because there's an indecency about her. I want you for a moment to think if there's all men talking about this and only men can be the ones that actually go through with the divorce, which school of thought do you think is going to be most popular in that day? Probably going to be the school of Hamel. It is. The school of Hamel is the one that they have found to be the prominent teaching during Jesus' day. And so Jesus is entering this conversation, and he's going to uphold 2 things that really no one wants to hear. And you can even see it in verse 10, where his disciples responded, this is the situation between a husband and a wife. It is better not to marry. What Jesus is going to hold up, one, is the intense value of marriage. And this is something that we as a church individually need to make sure that we're drawn to and focus in on. Because I know in my life, if I'm asked to do something, sometimes my immediate response can be, what is the bare minimum I have to do? What is the bare minimum requirement that I need to complete the task at hand? I think a lot of times when we come to follow Jesus and follow God, and he asks us and he leads us to do something, we don't always jump in full-hearted and give everything we've got. We want to come in and say, God, what's the bare minimum I can do, and you still be happy? And as we get to marriage, how many times do we view our own relationship with our spouses in that way? If you pause and you look at what our culture tells us, you don't have to go far in any TV show or any movie to see that marriage is not that important. That marriage is really more just kind of the social, what they would say, construct, this development that we just came up with. So our culture doesn't value marriage. And if anything, it's just a tax benefit. And yet, what Jesus says, he's going to say, no, it has immense value. And what he's going to point to is that 2 people will become one flesh. And if your relationship, you've spent any time with your spouse for any amount of time, and it's been serious, you know that you've rubbed off on one another. And you begin to think about and know what the other person's thinking, or you might know how they respond to a certain situation. But really what Jesus is saying is that 2 people will become one. I want you to go down into Ephesians. I'll read it. You don't have to go there. Ephesians 5:31 to 32. I know I'm jumping around today, but what we're talking about, I feel like we need to. It says, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the 2 will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but here's what I want you to see what Paul does. But I am talking about Christ in the church. So as Paul is sitting here and he's trying to talk about Christ in the church, he picks on marriage as the best illustration of our relationship with Jesus. For a moment, do you see that Jesus is leaning in and saying, this is what marriage is supposed to be? He's upholding the beauty and the sanctity of marriage. So many times we go into our relationship with our spouses, we want to know what the bare minimum is. A few years ago, we were at our first church full-time. We were in Kentucky, and we had our first son, Ezra, and Victoria was pregnant with Lena. And so her birthday is July 31st. And so it was summertime, and during the summertime for that church, they would do like this big t-ball league, and a lot of people from the community would come out. You would have maybe like 200-300 kids that would come out to this t-ball league. And so it was expected. It was not a written requirement, but it was an unspoken expectation that all staff members would have to be a part of it. And so I met with the children's pastor, and Victoria, let me back up. Victoria and I had been serving as coaches for 2 years before then. And I was helping out on Saturdays pretty much all day. But this year, with Victoria being pregnant and all of our family and support 12 hours away, I came to the children's pastor, I came to the pastor, and I said, hey, I will help out on Saturdays, but I'm not going to coach this year. I can't. It's too much to do. Victoria and I are expecting Lena, and I just need to take a step back just for this year. He said, okay, fine. And a couple weeks later, I was brought in front of the deacon board, and I was told that I was not carrying my weight for this t-ball league. And so I was a lot younger then, not too much younger, but I was a little bit younger. And when I got criticized, I took it to heart. And so I can remember sitting in that meeting and not quite holding back tears, but I was pretty close to it. Because I'd already talked and I'd already worked this through with the two pastors, thought it was okay, and now being brought forward and saying I'm not doing enough. And I remember coming home before being pregnant, 9 months pregnant, and her coming in and speaking life back into me. Because at that point I was like furious, I was angry, and I was also broken over what had happened. And she is the one that lifted me back up and got me back on my feet and got me going again. And I say that because from my experience, I can face just about anything in life if I know that Victoria and I's relationship is strong. It's in those moments when I face extreme doubt or I've gone through a difficult season, the Lord has used Victoria time and time and time again to be the one that speaks through her to get me back to where I need to be. So what Jesus is doing is he's holding up and he's saying, in the very beginning, in Genesis 1, God creates man and woman. In Genesis 2, there's marriage that happens before the fall. Here's the ideal. Here's what I want us to pursue. Here's what I want us to go after. But then he also, in Matthew 19, is going to say, but the reality of the situation is that we live in a fallen and a broken world. And that sometimes you will find yourself in a relationship where your spouse has changed or where something has snapped or changed and you've maybe got to leave that marriage. So he's holding these two in tension. What Jesus does is he doesn't give you a clear answer for it. He doesn't go and say, here's the prescriptive thing. If this happens, then this should happen. What Jesus is doing is he's trying to teach us wisdom on how to approach the topic of marriage and divorce. That we have got to fight for our marriages because you're going to be the only one that fights for your marriage. But on the same side, we realize that we live in a fallen and a broken world. And so he sets the standard for divorce very high because he wants to be intentional with what he's telling us. Now, let's add on one more layer to what I'm talking about. If you go into the Old Testament, you will find examples of people getting divorced for reasons outside of adultery. If you go to 1 Corinthians 7, you'll find another reason for people getting a divorce outside of adultery. And so that's why I'm saying that Jesus is teaching you wisdom on how to approach marriage and divorce. Jesus is not being prescriptive and saying the only time you can ever divorce your spouse is if they commit adultery or they cheat on you. There's other examples in Scripture, but that's not the case. And so, as we talk about these two things, I've sat in plenty of sermons, I've heard plenty of pastors say that adultery is the only reason. And yet, from my experience, I've seen spouses where abuse is happening, the church won't come in. And and allow divorce or give their blessing on divorce. I don't think that's what Jesus had in mind. And so I cannot go into each of your relationships and say whether it's right or wrong. But I do want you to see the two tensions that Jesus creates. He does it intentionally. And Matthew, as he's going through the Sermon on the Mount, we've talked about time and time again, his goal is to teach you wisdom. Not prescriptive and saying, if this happens, then you should do this. So my encouragement for you is to hold those two things in tension. If you are married, may you fight for your marriage with all that you have, because it is a beautiful thing that God gave before the fall. It was a blessing that before sin entered the picture, marriage was there. The second thing is, if you are in a difficult spot, then I would encourage you to seek wisdom and to pray. Or if you are in the middle of a divorce or have experienced divorce, my encouragement for you would be, no matter what, I would assume that you're probably feeling some guilt. Maybe not. May you be reminded that Jesus' death on the cross is greater than any sins that you've committed. And sometimes we can hold into a sin of divorce. I don't know your situation. I'm just using this as an example. We can hold on to a sin of divorce, and that be the thing that defines you. That could be the thing that you feel guilty over, that you have failed at. And may I just remind you that Jesus' death on the cross is greater than that sin. There's no sin that is greater than what Jesus accomplished. So as we sit here and we're talking about this, and we find hope in what Jesus has accomplished for each of us. But if you're married, may I beg and implore you to uphold the sanctity of marriage. To see the beauty of what it offers. To fight for your spouse because no one else will. And Jesus creates these two tensions intentionally. That we should feel the weight of both of these things. He doesn't give a clear path forward necessarily. He talks about adultery. But he wants you to feel the weight of these two things. And so the last thing that I would make mention of is a lot of times we can, as a church, have these talks about marriage and have these talks about divorce. But it's not all there is for everyone. And so if you're here and you're single, that's okay. I don't want you to feel like Jesus is telling you that you have to go get married, but that each of us have a different calling in our life, different road and journey that we have. And so, as we talk about this, I know it may not directly apply to you, but may you help fight for that and give wisdom as you're talking to your friends, engaging with your friends and community, and know that you also have a very, very important role. And I don't even want to say like an also, it's both of these things. So that's it. That's our talk for today. I know it's a little different. And I know that I would be willing to bet that those of you that have gone through divorce or experienced it know how just utterly hurtful and painful the process is. And walking through it with my friends, it is something that I could not imagine to have walked. And so the Lord will draw close to you and be close to you in those moments. And remind yourself that Jesus' death on the cross is greater than anything that we have done. Any sins, any guilt that we have, Jesus gives us forgiveness for that. With that, I'm going to pray. And then I'll kind of explain what we're going to do next. Father, as we come to you, Lord, and we talk about marriage and divorce, God, may we feel the weight of what marriage is supposed to be. May we pursue our spouse with all that we have within us. And Lord, may you help to make those that are married in the room two fleshes into one. And God, for those that have gone through divorce, I pray that you would give them great comfort and strength. And Lord, reassure them that your death on the cross has forgiven any sin. And Lord, may they find their hope in you. God, we also just want to take a moment pray for the rest of the service as we get ready to go into communion. Help us to be reflective and thoughtful on your death